The stagecoach left Clara and her mother in a cloud of dust that didn't settle so much as relocate. From the road to their clothes, their skin, the inside of Clara's mouth. She spat and squinted at the ranch that was supposed to be their salvation. It looked like something God had given up on halfway through. The main house sagged in the middle like a broken spine. Fences leaned at angles that defied physics and common sense. A barn stood in the distance, its roof a patchwork of wood and hope. And what might have once been a chicken coop now served as a monument to architectural failure. "Well," Clara said, "at least we know he's desperate." Her mother, Iris, said nothing. Iris hadn't said much of anything since Cheyenne, or Laramie, or the 3 towns before that, each one smaller and meaner than the last, each one finding reasons why a widow and her spinster daughter didn't quite fit. Too proud, too poor, too something. Clara picked up both their bags, hers and the one her mother had set down like it weighed more than luggage had any right to. "Come on, Mama. Whatever's waiting inside can't be worse than what we left behind." That turned out to be optimistic. The front door opened before Clara could knock, and a man appeared who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts and regret. Tall, but stooped. Broad-shouldered, but hollow, in a way that had nothing to do with food. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and just as warm. "You're the housekeeper," he said. Not a question. "Clara Whitmore. This is my mother, Iris. And you're Caleb Rourke, who apparently doesn't believe in introductions." Something that might have been surprise crossed his face. "You always this direct? You always hire people you've never met?" "Fair point." He stepped aside. "Come in. Place isn't much, but it's falling apart?" Clara walked past him into a front room that smelled like old coffee and older dreams. "When's the last time someone cleaned in here?" "I manage." "No, you exist. There's a difference." Clara set the bags down and ran a finger along the mantel. It came away black. "How long since your last housekeeper quit?" 6 months. "And before that?" 4 months. "Starting to see a pattern, Mr. Rourke." He crossed his arms. "They couldn't handle the work." "Or they couldn't handle you." Clara turned to face him properly. In the dim light, she could see the details her mother's letters had left out. The scar above his left eyebrow. The permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking at horizons. The way he held himself like a man who'd forgotten how to be comfortable in his own skin. "Let me guess. You hired them, barely spoke to them, paid them late, and wondered why they didn't stick around." "I paid what I promised." "Eventually, I'm guessing." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You want the job or not?" "Depends. You gonna tell me why you really need help?" "I just told you. You told me about housekeepers. I'm asking about the ranch." Clara gestured toward the window, toward the land beyond that she'd studied from the stagecoach. "I saw 3 sections on the way in that should be grazing cattle, but aren't. Saw fence lines that don't match property markers. Saw a water access point that looks like it's been deliberately diverted. So I'll ask again, why do you really need help?" The silence that followed had weight to it. Caleb walked to the window, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You know anything about ranching?" "I know about patterns, and I know when someone's being squeezed." "That obvious?" "To someone who's been paying attention." Clara moved to stand beside him. From this angle, she could see more of the property, the skeletal remains of what might have once been a thriving operation, now picked clean by time and circumstance. "Who's squeezing you?" "Helena Graves." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the way Caleb said it, like he was confessing to something, told her everything she needed to know. "Neighbor?" she guessed. "Neighbor. Landowner. Cattle baron. Take your pick." Caleb's reflection in the dirty window looked older than the man standing beside her. "Owns most of the territory between here and the mountains. Wants what I've got too." "And what's that?" "Water rights. My land sits on the only year-round creek for 20 miles. Everything else dries up come August. She's been trying to buy me out for 3 years." "But you won't sell." "Can't. It's all I've got left." Clara studied him, really studied him, and saw a man who'd bet everything on a losing hand and couldn't figure out how to fold. She recognized it because she'd seen it in mirrors across 6 states, in boarding houses and back rooms and places where women like her learned that sometimes survival meant knowing when to walk away. But she was tired of walking. "Show me the books," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "Your financial records, ledgers, whatever system you're using to track expenses and income. Show me." "You're a housekeeper." "I'm someone who can read numbers and spot problems. And right now, Mr. Rourke, I'm betting you've got both." Clara turned to face him fully. "You can hire me to dust your shelves and cook your meals, and I'll do that. But if you want to keep this ranch, if you actually want to fight instead of just slowly drowning, then you need to trust me with more than your laundry. I don't even know you. You knew me well enough to hire me sight unseen based on a letter from a minister in Cheyenne who probably told you I was capable and hardworking and in need of honest employment." Clara watched his expression confirm she'd guessed right. "What he didn't tell you is that I kept books for my father's store until he died. Managed inventory for 3 different boarding houses. Can calculate profit margins in my head faster than most men can write them down. And I've been watching people try to push me aside my entire life. So I'm real good at spotting when someone's doing it to someone else. And you think you can help. I think if you had better options, you'd have taken them already." It wasn't encouragement. It wasn't even hope. It was just math, cold and clean and impossible to argue with. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, then walked to a desk buried under papers and regret. He pulled out a ledger that looked like it had survived a war and lost. "Here." Clara opened it and immediately wished she hadn't. The numbers were a disaster, not just bad, but catastrophically, almost impressively bad. Expenses that didn't track, income that had been steadily declining for 18 months, debts listed in 3 different hands, like Caleb had been too ashamed to write them all himself. "When's your next loan payment due?" she asked. 3 weeks. "And you have how much saved?" The silence answered that question. Clara flipped through more pages, her stomach sinking with each entry. This wasn't just a struggling ranch. This was an execution, drawn out and methodical. The kind of thing that happened when someone powerful wanted you gone and had the patience to make it look natural. "Your workers," she said. "How many quit in the last year?" 5, maybe 6, maybe. 2 of them just disappeared, didn't even collect final pay. And you thought that was normal? Thought they found better prospects. But in what? A territory where Helena Graves controls most of the employment? Clara closed the ledger. "Mr. Rourke, those men didn't find better prospects. They were bought off, or scared off. Either way, it's the same result. You're losing workers faster than you can replace them, which means the ranch falls apart faster, which means you get desperate faster, which means I sell to Helena for whatever she's willing to offer." "Exactly." Caleb slumped into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. "So what do I do?" Clara looked at him, at this man who'd been beaten down so thoroughly he'd forgotten how to stand up, and made a decision that would change everything. "You let me fight back." The first week Clara cleaned, not because the house needed it, though it desperately did, but because cleaning gave her time to think, and thinking was the only weapon she had. She scrubbed floors and washed windows and beat dust from curtains that probably hadn't been touched since Caleb's wife left. That had been 4 years ago, according to the wedding photograph she found in a drawer, shoved under old receipts and broken promises. The woman in the picture looked happy, young, nothing like the ghost Caleb had become. "She took the kids?" Clara asked one morning, holding up the photograph. Caleb, halfway through coffee that had gone cold, nodded. "Back to her family in Kansas, said she couldn't do it anymore. The isolation, the work, me, probably." "You try to stop her?" "Why would I? She was right." Clara set the photograph on the mantel where it belonged. Being right doesn't make it hurt less. Speaking from experience, I'm 32, unmarried, and currently employed as a housekeeper in the middle of nowhere. What do you think? Something almost like a smile crossed Caleb's face. Fair point. They fell into a routine after that. Clara would wake before dawn, start coffee, and begin the day's inventory. Not of dust and dirt, but of problems and patterns. Caleb would stumble down an hour later, drink whatever she'd prepared, and head out to tackle work that was always more than one man could handle. And Iris would sit by the window, watching the horizon like she expected something to appear. "Mama," Clara said one afternoon, setting down a basket of mending, "you need to talk to me." Iris didn't turn from the window. "I know you're angry about leaving Cheyenne, about leaving all the places before that, but staying silent isn't going to change anything." Still nothing. Clara felt frustration rise like heat. "Fine, don't talk. But I'm not leaving this place, you understand? We're out of options, out of money, out of people willing to take us in. So whatever you're feeling, whatever you're thinking, you're going to have to feel it here, because there's nowhere else left to go." Iris's shoulders tightened, but she didn't speak. Clara left her there and went to find Caleb. She found him in the barn, trying to repair a wagon wheel that looked beyond salvation. He was attacking it with the kind of determination that came from refusing to accept reality. "That wheel's done," Clara said. "I can fix it. You can waste time trying, or you can tell me about Helena Graves." Caleb's hammer missed the nail entirely. "Why?" "Because I've been here a week and I still don't know what I'm up against. You said she owns most of the territory. What does that actually mean?" He set down the hammer with more force than necessary. "Means she owns the land, the cattle, the people, has contracts with the railroad, supplies most of the territory's beef. When she wants something, she gets it." "How?" "Money, mostly. She'll buy out smaller ranchers, offer them more than their land's worth, then consolidate. Anyone who won't sell—" He trailed off. "What happens to them?" "Workers quit, accidents happen, loans get called in. Eventually they sell anyway." "But not you." "Not yet." Clara walked around the broken wagon, thinking, "This water access you mentioned, the creek. How much of your land does it run through?" "About half. Enters on the north end, exits southeast." "And Helena's land?" "Surrounds mine on 3 sides. Only access to the creek is through my property." "So if she owns you, she controls the water supply for the entire region." "That's about it." Clara stopped walking. "Mr. Rourke, you're not sitting on a failing ranch. You're sitting on a choke point. That's why she hasn't just crushed you outright. She needs you to sell willingly, so it looks legitimate. Because if people think she's forcing you out, if there's even a whisper of impropriety, that's the kind of thing that could get territorial authorities involved. Authorities don't care about one small ranch. They care about water rights. They care about monopolies. They care when someone powerful looks like they're playing dirty." Clara leaned against the wagon. "We just have to make them look." Caleb shook his head. "You don't understand what you're suggesting. Helena Graves isn't someone you fight. She's someone you survive if you're lucky." "Then it's a good thing I'm not interested in luck." "Clara, I spent 32 years being small, Mr. Rourke, being quiet, being whatever people needed me to be so they wouldn't notice me too much, want too much, expect too much. And where did it get me? Here, broken, desperate, and one step away from complete disappearance." She straightened. "So no, I'm not interested in surviving Helena Graves. I'm interested in beating her. With what? We have no money, no workers, no leverage. We have intelligence, we have desperation, and we have the one thing she wants and can't take by force." Clara picked up Caleb's abandoned hammer. "That's more than nothing. That's a start." So, the second week, Clara started building. Not structures. They didn't have money for that. She built intelligence networks from gossip and observation, started paying attention to who came and went from town, who worked for Helena, who owed her, who feared her. The picture that emerged was even worse than she'd imagined. Helena Graves wasn't just a cattle baron. She was a system, one that had meticulously constructed dependencies across the entire territory. She owned the general store, which meant she controlled supplies, owned the boarding house, which meant she controlled housing, had financial stakes in the saloon, the livery, the grain mill. Anyone who wanted to do business in the region either worked with Helena or didn't work at all. And the people who tried to stand against her? They didn't last long. 3 ranchers in 5 years, the woman at the general store told Clara, her voice low. Her name was Martha, and she had the pinched look of someone who'd learned to speak carefully. All of them had land Helena wanted. All of them refused to sell. All of them gone now. Gone where? Clara asked, selecting supplies she couldn't quite afford. First one sold after his cattle got sick. Disease, supposedly. Whole herd had to be destroyed. And the second? His workers left. All of them, same week. Couldn't keep the ranch running alone. Sold within a month. Clara's hand stilled over a bag of flour. And the third? Martha's expression went carefully blank. Accident. Tragic. Happened during a storm. The words had the rhythm of something rehearsed, something everyone had agreed to say so they wouldn't have to think about what they actually meant. Clara paid for her supplies, barely, and left before her anger became visible. She found Caleb in the north pasture, staring at the creek that was supposedly his salvation. The water looked clear and cold and utterly indifferent to human desperation. Martha told me about the other ranchers, Clara said. Caleb didn't turn. Then you know what you're suggesting is suicide. I'm suggesting we don't have a choice. We always have a choice. We can sell. Take whatever Helena offers. Start over somewhere else. With what money? You're underwater on debts. You sell now, you'll be lucky to walk away with enough to buy a wagon. Clara moved to stand beside him. And where would you go? What would you do? You're a rancher. This is all you know. Better than dead. Is it? The question hung between them like gun smoke. Caleb finally looked at her. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Fighting for a place that isn't yours. A problem that isn't your responsibility. You could leave, find work somewhere else, somewhere safer. Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mr. Rourke, I've spent my entire life looking for somewhere safer. You know what I learned? Nowhere is safe. Not for women like me. Not for people who don't fit into whatever neat categories everyone else has decided on. She picked up a stone and threw it into the creek, watching the ripples spread. At least here, I'm fighting for something that matters. At least here, when I lose, if I lose, it'll be because I tried. Not because I accepted what everyone else decided I deserved. And if fighting gets you killed, then I'll die doing something other than disappearing. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. All right. You want to fight Helena Graves? We'll fight, but we do it smart. We do it careful. And the second it looks like we're going to lose, we run. Deal. Clara held out her hand. Deal. They shook on it there, beside the creek that was worth killing for, and Clara felt something shift. Not hope exactly. More like possibility. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. They just had to figure out what the hell to do with it. The answer came from an unexpected place. Iris. Clara's mother had been silent for so long that hearing her voice felt like a minor miracle. You're thinking too big, Iris said one evening, her first words in nearly a month. Clara almost dropped the pan she was washing. Mama? Helena Graves. You're thinking about her like she's the problem. She's not. She's the symptom. Iris turned from the window where she'd been posted like a sentry. The problem is dependency. Everyone in this territory depends on her for something. You can't beat her by confronting her directly. You have to break the dependencies. Clara set down the pan carefully. How? Give people an alternative, something she doesn't control, something she can't buy, or intimidate, or manipulate. Iris's eyes, the same sharp green as Clara's, focused with an intensity that had been missing for months. You have a resource she wants. Use it differently than she expects. The water. Not just the water, the land. The location. The fact that you're right here, between her holdings and the town. Iris stood, and Clara realized she couldn't remember the last time her mother had stood without being prompted. You said the ranch is failing because you can't compete with Helena's operation. So don't compete. Do something she can't. The idea formed slowly, like dawn breaking over unfamiliar territory. Food, Clara said. Not cattle. Prepared food. Meals. Iris nodded. The boarding house, the saloon, they all serve food, but it's basic, functional. If you could offer something better, something different. We don't have money for that, Caleb said from the doorway. Neither woman had noticed him arrive. Can't even pay for the supplies we need now. We have a kitchen, we have water, we have land we're not using for anything productive. Clara's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. We start small, garden vegetables, eggs, basic provisions. We sell them cheaper than Helena's store because we're not trying to profit. We're trying to build reputation. Reputation doesn't pay debts. No, but it builds dependencies, and dependencies create leverage. Clara turned to face him fully. Right now, everyone in this territory needs Helena for something. But if we can make them need us, even just a little, then we're not just a dying ranch anymore. We're a problem she has to solve carefully. Caleb looked between Clara and Iris, uncertainty written across his face. This is insane. Yes, Iris agreed, but it's less insane than trying to fight a cattle baron on her own terms. And if it fails? Clara smiled, sharp and dangerous. Then we fail doing something interesting. They started with chickens. It was Iris's idea, practical, manageable, quick to show results. Caleb had an old coop that hadn't been used in years, half collapsed but salvageable. Clara spent 3 days rebuilding it while her mother negotiated with a farmer on the edge of Helena's territory for a dozen laying hens and a rooster. I can't afford chickens, Caleb said, watching Clara hammer boards into place. You're not buying them. I am. With what money? Clara didn't answer because the answer would have required explaining that she'd sold the one valuable thing she owned, her mother's wedding ring, pawned in 3 different towns and recovered each time, to a jeweler in town for a fraction of its worth. Some things were better kept private. The chickens arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a farmer who looked nervous the entire transaction. Miss Graves won't like this, he muttered, handing over the crate. Miss Graves doesn't need to know, Clara replied. She knows everything. Then she already knows and hasn't stopped us, which means she doesn't care. Yet. The farmer left quickly, like association itself was dangerous. The chickens settled in better than expected. Within a week, they were producing enough eggs that Clara could start her next phase, building relationships. She began with the boarding house. The owner was a tired woman named Ruth, who looked like she'd been doing the same job for 30 years and expected to do it for 30 more. Her kitchen was functional but joyless, the kind of place where food was fuel, nothing more. I can get eggs from Helena's store, Ruth said when Clara made her pitch. Yes, but how much are you paying? Ruth named a price that made Clara's eyes narrow. I'll sell you a dozen for half that. Half? What's wrong with them? Nothing. I just don't have overhead like the general store. Don't have workers to pay. Don't have rent. Clara set a basket of eggs on the counter. Try them. If they're not good, don't buy more. Ruth examined the eggs with suspicion, then cracked one into a bowl. The yolk sat up proud and orange, nothing like the pale, watery things from the general store. All right, Ruth said finally. I'll take 2 dozen a week, but if the quality drops, you'll be the first to know. They shook on it, and Clara walked out with her first real income. It wasn't much, barely enough to matter in the grand scheme of debts and desperation. But it was a start. Proof that the theory could work. More importantly, it was proof that she could work. The garden came next. The land behind the main house was overgrown but workable. Caleb helped clear it, his skepticism gradually giving way to something that might have been interest. When's the last time you grew anything? Clara asked, pulling weeds with more aggression than strictly necessary. My wife had a garden before she left. Did you help? Sometimes. And after she was gone, Caleb's silence was answer enough. Clara sat back on her heels, studying him. Mr. Rourke, can I ask you something personal? You've been living in my house for 3 weeks. Seems like that ship has sailed. When did you give up? He flinched like she'd struck him. What? On the ranch? On yourself? On the idea that things could get better? When did you decide that losing was inevitable? Caleb pulled a weed so hard it came up with half the dirt around it. About 6 months after Helena made her first offer. When I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, I was still sinking. That the game was rigged and I'd been too stupid to see it. And you've been waiting to drown ever since. I've been surviving. No, you've been dying slowly. There's a difference. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. I'm not going to pretend I can save this ranch, Mr. Rourke. Maybe we'll fail. Maybe Helena will crush us and we'll lose everything anyway. but I'll be damned if I'm going to spend however long we have left just waiting for the end." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara saw something other than defeat in his eyes. "All right," he said. "What do we plant?" They planted everything they could get seeds for: potatoes and carrots and beans, herbs that Iris remembered from a garden 30 years ago, tomatoes that might not survive the altitude but were worth trying. Every inch of cleared ground became dedicated to growth, to the radical act of believing that investing in the future might actually matter. And slowly, painfully slowly, things began to change. The boarding house started buying more than eggs. Ruth wanted vegetables, wanted herbs for her cooking, wanted anything that would make her meals stand out from the competition. She couldn't afford much, but enough to matter. The saloon came next. The owner, a gruff man named Sam, initially refused on principle. "I don't need fancy vegetables. My customers want whiskey and meat." "Your customers want anything that doesn't taste like boot leather," Clara countered. "When's the last time you served a meal someone complimented?" Sam couldn't answer that. He started buying potatoes, then onions. Then, grudgingly, some of the herbs Iris had coaxed to life against all odds. His customers noticed, started commenting, started coming back more often. Word spread. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of triumph, no sudden reversal of fortune, just a slow, steady accumulation of small victories. A few more customers, a few more coins, a few more people in the territory who depended on the Rourke Ranch for something other than failure. And Helena Graves noticed. The first sign came in the form of a visitor. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, dressed too well for the territory, and riding a horse that cost more than Caleb's entire operation. He introduced himself as Marcus Fell, Helena Graves's business manager. "Miss Graves wanted me to check on Mr. Rourke's welfare," he said, his smile as genuine as a marked card. "She's heard rumors of difficulty." "We're managing," Clara said before Caleb could respond. Marcus's eyes flicked to her, reassessing. "And you are?" "The housekeeper." "I see. Well, I'm sure Mr. Rourke can speak for himself." "I'm sure he can, but I'm the one who answers the door, so you're speaking to me." Clara crossed her arms. "What does Miss Graves want?" "Simply to extend her previous offer, with modifications given the ranch's declining state. She's prepared to offer—" "We're not selling." Marcus's smile thinned. "Perhaps you didn't hear the amount." "I didn't need to. The answer is no." "Mr. Rourke." Caleb, who'd been standing behind Clara like a man watching a show he didn't quite understand, finally spoke. She said no. Marcus looked between them, his expression calculating. "Miss Graves has been very patient, but patience has limits. It would be unfortunate if circumstances forced a less favorable arrangement." "Is that a threat?" Clara asked. "It's a reality. This territory is changing, consolidating. Those who adapt will prosper. Those who resist—" He shrugged. "Well, we've all seen what happens to them. Then I guess we'll see what happens to us." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "I'll convey your decision to Miss Graves. I'm sure she'll be interested to hear about her new employee." He left, and Clara watched him go with a sense of inevitability settling over her shoulders. "I just made things worse," she said. "Maybe," Caleb agreed, "or maybe you just made them interesting." That night, lying in the small room that was barely more than a closet, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered what she'd started. Helena Graves knew about her now. Knew she was interfering, knew she wasn't going to step aside quietly. The smart thing would be to back down, to accept that some fights couldn't be won. But Clara had never been particularly smart about knowing when to quit. She fell asleep planning the next phase, her mind full of numbers and strategies, and the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a fight worth having. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed close and infinite, indifferent to human ambition. And somewhere in the darkness, Helena Graves was making plans of her own. The problem started small, the way rot always does. First, it was the chickens. Clara went to feed them one morning and found 2 dead, their necks twisted at angles that had nothing to do with natural causes. No blood, no signs of a predator, just death, delivered with precision. She buried them without telling Caleb, but he noticed anyway. "Coyotes?" he asked, watching her wash her hands at the pump. Coyotes don't break necks and leave the bodies. His jaw tightened. Helena. Can't prove it. Don't need to prove what we both know. Clara dried her hands on her apron, studying the henhouse like it might offer answers. She's testing us, seeing if we'll scare easy. And if we don't, then she'll escalate. She did. The next week, 3 of Caleb's fence posts were cut clean through, letting what remained of his cattle wander onto the road. It took them half a day to round up the animals, and when they did, one was missing entirely. Clara found it 2 days later in a ravine, its leg broken, buzzards already circling. Caleb put it down himself, his face empty of everything except the kind of exhaustion that came from losing battles before they'd even started. "We can't keep this up," he said that night, slumped at the kitchen table. "Every time we fix something, she breaks 2 more things. It's math, Clara. Simple math. We're going to lose. Not if we change the equation." "With what? Optimism?" Clara slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups jump. "With intelligence. With adaptation. With the understanding that Helena Graves is used to people who fight her the same way, ranchers trying to outranch her, businessmen trying to outbusiness her. She's never dealt with someone who refuses to play her game. Because everyone who tried ended up broke or dead. Or because no one's tried the right way yet." Clara leaned forward. "She's attacking the ranch because that's what she knows how to destroy. Fine. We make the ranch less important. We build something she can't touch as easily. The food business. Exactly. Right now it's supplemental, a side operation. We need to make it central, make it matter so much that attacking it becomes complicated." Iris, who'd been listening from her post by the window, finally spoke. "You'll need more customers, more volume. Right now, you're selling to Ruth and Sam. That's not enough to build real protection." "I know." Clara had been turning this problem over in her mind for days. "We need to reach people Helena doesn't control directly. Workers on the railroad crews, miners from the camps up north, anyone operating outside her immediate sphere." "Those crews are 40 miles away," Caleb said. "How do you plan to reach them?" Clara smiled, and there was something sharp in it. "We don't go to them. We make them come to us." The plan was ambitious to the point of recklessness, which meant it was exactly the kind of thing Clara was starting to specialize in. The railroad crews worked 12-hour shifts and ate food that was, by all accounts, barely edible. The mining camps were worse, men paying inflated prices for supplies Helena's store shipped in, with no alternatives and no complaints because complaining meant losing your job. But both groups had money, and both groups were hungry for anything that didn't taste like desperation. Clara spent 2 days preparing. She cooked everything she could from the garden: bread, vegetable stew, potato cakes, dried herbs bundled and labeled. She packed it all in crates borrowed from the barn, wrapped in cloth that had been washed so many times it was more memory than fabric. "This is everything we have," Caleb said, watching her load the wagon. "If this doesn't work, it'll work." "You can't know that." "No, but I can act like I do, which is almost the same thing." Iris climbed onto the wagon beside Clara, moving with a purpose that had been absent for months. "I'm coming." "Mama, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You'll need help selling, and I'm tired of sitting by that window waiting for something to happen." Iris settled herself on the bench, her back straight. "Drive." The road to the railroad camps was rough enough to rattle teeth, and worse for wagons that were already half broken. Clara drove anyway, pushing the horses harder than she probably should have, racing against her own doubts. They reached the first camp just before noon. It was a sprawling mess of tents and temporary structures housing maybe 200 men who looked like they'd been working since before dawn. A supervisor approached as Clara pulled the wagon to a stop, a thick man with a face that suggested he'd seen every con and scheme the West had to offer. "We don't allow peddlers," he said. "Good thing I'm not peddling. I'm selling food." Clara gestured to the crates. "Real food. Made this morning. Better than whatever slop you're serving from that cook tent." The supervisor's eyes narrowed. "Miss Graves supplies our provisions. And I'm sure she charges you appropriately for the privilege. I'm offering an alternative." "At what price?" Clara named a figure she'd calculated down to the cent, high enough to matter, low enough to undercut Helena's monopoly. The supervisor considered this, then called over one of the workers. "Try it," he ordered. The worker, a young man with coal dust still on his face, took a piece of bread, bit into it cautiously, then stopped. His expression shifted from suspicion to something close to wonder. "It's good," he said, like he'd forgotten food could be. "How much for the lot?" the supervisor asked. Clara sold everything in 40 minutes. The workers crowded around the wagon, buying bread and stew and potato cakes with money they probably couldn't afford to spend. They didn't care. For the first time in months, maybe years, they were eating something that tasted like someone had cared enough to make it properly. When the crates were empty and the coins were counted, Clara had more money than the ranch had seen in 6 months. "When can you come back?" the supervisor asked. 2 weeks. Same time. More variety. We'll be waiting." The second camp went even better. Word had somehow spread, the mysterious efficiency of men who had nothing to do but work and talk, and they were expected. Clara sold out in 20 minutes and took orders for the next visit. On the way back, Iris counted the money 3 times, like she couldn't believe the numbers. "It's enough to make the loan payment," she said finally, "with some left over." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "It's a start." "It's more than a start, it's proof." They drove home in silence, watching the sun sink toward mountains that didn't care about human victory or defeat. But Clara cared. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like they had a chance, small and fragile and absolutely real. Caleb met them at the barn, his expression uncertain. "How did it—" Clara handed him the money. He stared at it like she'd handed him a miracle instead of coins and worn bills. "This is enough, for now." Clara climbed down from the wagon, her body aching in ways that had nothing to do with the road. "We do this again in 2 weeks. Build it into a route. Railroad camps, mining operations, anywhere Helena's reach is weak. We turn this into something she can't easily break. She'll try anyway. Of course she will. But now we have resources to fight back with. Now we're not just surviving, we're competing." Clara looked at him straight on. "You asked me when you gave up. I'm asking you now. Are you ready to stop?" Caleb's hand closed around the money, his knuckles white. Yeah, I think I am." That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed and let herself feel something dangerously close to hope. They weren't safe. They weren't even close to winning. But they were moving forward instead of sinking, and that was more than she'd had in years. She should have known it wouldn't last. The attack came on a Tuesday, 3 days before they were scheduled to make another supply run. Clara woke to smoke. Not the familiar smell of the cook stove, but something thicker, angrier. She was out of bed and down the stairs before her brain fully caught up with her body. The barn was burning. Flames climbed the old wood like they'd been waiting their entire existence for this moment. Caleb was already outside in his nightshirt, hauling water from the pump in buckets that would never be enough. "The horses!" he shouted. Clara ran. The barn door was blocked by fire, so she went around to the side where a window hung crooked on broken hinges. She kicked it in, ignoring the glass that bit into her feet, and crawled through into smoke so thick it felt solid. The horses were screaming. Clara found them by sound more than sight, their stalls at the far end where the fire hadn't reached yet. She threw open the first door and the mare bolted past her, nearly trampling her in panic. The second horse, Caleb's gelding, refused to move, too terrified to understand salvation when it was offered. "Come on, you stupid animal!" Clara grabbed its halter and pulled. The gelding fought her, wild-eyed and desperate. Smoke was filling her lungs now, making everything distant and strange. She could hear Caleb shouting but couldn't make out words. She pulled harder. The gelding finally moved, stumbling after her toward the broken window. Clara shoved it through first, heard it hit the ground outside, then dragged herself after it. Hands grabbed her, Caleb's, pulling her away from the barn as part of the roof collapsed inward with a sound like the world breaking. They sat in the dirt, watching everything burn. The barn, the tools, the wagon they'd used for the supply runs, all of it consumed by fire that had been deliberately set. Clara could smell the kerosene even through the smoke. Iris appeared with blankets, wrapping one around Clara's shoulders without speaking. They sat together as the sun rose over the destruction, painting the smoke gold and beautiful and utterly indifferent. "How much did we lose?" Clara finally asked. Caleb's voice was flat. "Most of the feed, all the spare tack, the wagon, maybe $300 worth of equipment we can't replace." The money from the supply run? In the house. Safe. Clara nodded, her mind already moving past shock into calculation. We need a new wagon. Need to rebuild before the next scheduled run. Clara. Caleb turned to look at her, his face streaked with soot and defeat. We can't keep doing this. She's going to kill us. Maybe not directly, maybe not today, but eventually she'll push too hard and someone's going to die. Then we push back harder. With what? We're out of options, out of luck, out of everything except the ability to take a beating. Clara stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Her feet were bleeding from the glass, her lungs burned from smoke, and every part of her hurt in ways she'd catalog later. But her voice was steady. No, we're out of the ability to fight her the way she expects, so we stop fighting that way. She looked at the burning barn, at the destruction that was meant to break them. She wants us scared, wants us to sell and disappear quietly. Instead, we're going to make ourselves impossible to erase. How? By making sure everyone knows what she's doing, by turning her tactics into weapons against her. Clara's hands clenched into fists. She thinks she can destroy us in the dark. Fine. We drag everything into the light. The town meeting hall was a modest building that mostly served for disputes over property lines and complaints about stray livestock. Clara had never been inside, had never had reason to. But she walked in that Saturday morning like she owned the place. 20 people had gathered, more curiosity than sympathy, probably. News of the barn fire had spread the way. All news spread in small territories, fast and distorted and eager for drama. Martha from the general store was there, Ruth from the boarding house, Sam from the saloon, the supervisor from the railroad camp. A handful of ranchers whose names Clara didn't know, but whose expressions she recognized, people who'd learned to keep their heads down and their opinions quiet. And in the back, arms crossed and expression unreadable, stood Marcus Fell. Clara had expected Helena herself to show, but apparently the cattle baron was too important to attend meetings with the people she was crushing. She sent her business manager instead, to watch and report back. Fine. Let him watch. Thank you for coming, Clara started, her voice carrying in the small space. I know most of you don't know me. I'm Clara Whitmore. I work for Caleb Rourke, and 4 days ago someone burned down his barn. Murmurs rippled through the room. Now, I'm not here to make accusations. Can't prove who did it, can't prove why. But I can tell you what I know. Clara began counting on her fingers. I know that in the past 3 years, 5 of Mr. Rourke's ranch hands have quit or disappeared. I know his cattle have gotten sick despite being healthy the week before. I know fence posts have been cut and supplies have gone missing, and his financial situation has gotten worse even when he's working harder than ever. More murmurs, some uncomfortable shifting. I also know that every rancher who's refused to sell to Helena Graves has experienced similar problems. Cattle dying, workers leaving, accidents that aren't quite accidents. Clara looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. And I know that everyone in this room knows it too. You've just been smart enough not to say it out loud. Miss Whitmore, Marcus Fell's voice cut through the room like a blade. These are serious allegations. Do you have any proof? Do I need proof when everyone here has watched it happen? When you've all seen ranchers sell out at a loss after mysterious misfortunes? When you all know that crossing Helena Graves is bad for business and worse for health? What Miss Graves does or doesn't do is her business, Marcus said smoothly. She operates within the law. If Mr. Rourke is having difficulties, perhaps he should reconsider her generous offers instead of making wild accusations. I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. Clara turned back to the crowd. Here's another fact. We've started a food supply business. We're selling to the railroad camps, the mining operations, anywhere that wants an alternative to overpriced provisions from the general store. We're successful. And 4 days after our second run, someone burned down our barn. Coincidence, Marcus said. Maybe. But here's what's not a coincidence. Helena Graves has built her empire by making sure no one has alternatives, no one competes, no one challenges. And anyone who tries ends up broke, scared, or gone. Clara's voice hardened. Well, I'm not broke yet. I'm definitely not scared. And I'm not going anywhere. The room went silent. Marcus stepped forward, his expression still calm, but something dangerous in his eyes. Miss Whitmore, you're new here. You don't understand how things work. This territory has an order, a system. Miss Graves has built something stable and prosperous. Disrupting that helps no one. It helps everyone who's tired of having one person control their entire livelihood. It helps every rancher who wants to keep their land. It helps every worker who wants to eat food that doesn't taste like punishment. Clara crossed her arms. And if that disrupts Helena Graves's monopoly, good. Maybe disruption is exactly what this territory needs. Be careful, Miss Whitmore. Actions have consequences. Is that a threat? It's advice. From someone who's seen what happens to people who overestimate their importance. Clara smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. Then I guess we'll see if I'm overestimating. But here's something for you to take back to Miss Graves. I'm not going to disappear quietly. Neither is Caleb Rourke. You burn our barn, we'll rebuild. You sabotage our business, we'll adapt. You try to crush us, we'll make so much noise that territorial authorities start asking questions about monopolies and suspicious accidents and why one woman controls everything in this region. You have no proof of anything illegal. Not yet, but I'm a patient woman with nothing to lose and a talent for paying attention. Give me time, Mr. Fell. I'll find something. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, then nodded curtly and left. The door slammed behind him with finality. The remaining crowd looked at Clara like she'd just declared war on the weather. Impressive in its audacity, doomed in its execution. Ruth spoke first. You just made an enemy of the most powerful person in the territory. I made an enemy the day I refused to disappear on command. Clara looked around at the assembled faces. I'm not asking any of you to help. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm just asking you to remember what you saw here. Remember that someone stood up. And when something happens to me or to Caleb or to that ranch, you'll know why. She left before anyone could respond, walking out into sunlight that felt too bright after the dim hall. Caleb was waiting with the horses, his expression impossible to read. How bad was it? I just threatened Helena Graves' business manager in front of 20 witnesses. So bad. Or good, depending on how you look at it. Clara took the reins he offered. We're committed now, no going back. Was there ever a way back? Probably not, but now it's official. They rode toward the ranch in silence, both aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Clara had made them visible, had made their fight public. It was strategic and necessary and possibly suicidal, but it was also honest. For the first time in her life, Clara wasn't hiding, wasn't making herself smaller to fit into spaces that didn't want her. She was standing full height and daring the world to do its worst. The world, she suspected, was about to take her up on that offer. Back at the ranch, Iris was waiting with news that made everything more complicated. Someone came by while you were gone, she said. A woman. She wouldn't give her name, but she left this. She handed Clara an envelope. Expensive paper, no marking. Inside was a single sheet with 2 sentences written in elegant script. You're right about the pattern. Meet me at the old Miller property tomorrow at noon if you want proof. Clara read it twice, her mind racing. This could be a trap. Probably is, Caleb agreed. Or it could be someone who actually knows something, someone who's tired of staying quiet. And if it's Helena setting you up? Clara folded the note carefully. Then I guess I'll find out tomorrow at noon. Iris shook her head. You're going anyway, aren't you? Of course I am. We need proof. Real proof, not just patterns and suspicions. If this person has it, if this person exists, Caleb interrupted, could be someone luring you out alone. So come with me. Both of us leave. The ranch is undefended. Mama can handle things for a few hours. They argued about it until dark, but Clara's mind was made up. This was the break they needed, the thing that could transform their fight from desperate resistance into actual strategy. She wasn't going to let caution stop her now. That night, she cleaned her father's old pistol, the one thing of his she'd kept besides debt and disappointment. She'd never fired it, wasn't even sure it worked, but having it felt better than being completely unarmed. Morning came too fast and too slow. Clara dressed carefully, practically. Boots that could run, clothes that wouldn't snag, hair tied back tight. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. Caleb insisted on riding with her to the property line, even though they both knew it wouldn't help if things went wrong. The Miller property was 3 miles north, abandoned after the family had sold to Helena 2 years ago. The house was falling apart, the land overgrown. A perfect place for an ambush, or a perfect place for a secret meeting. They rode in silence, tension building with each mile. When they reached the property line, Caleb stopped. "I don't like this." "I know. If you're not back in 2 hours, I'll be back." Clara rode the last stretch alone, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the brush. The old Miller house appeared through the trees like something from a ghost story. Windows broken, door hanging crooked, the whole structure leaning slightly to the left. A horse was tied to the fence. Clara dismounted, her hand on the pistol in her belt. "Hello?" A woman stepped out from the house. She was maybe 40, dressed well but not ostentatiously. There was something familiar about her face, though Clara couldn't place it. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Who are you?" "My name is Anna Reeves. My husband worked for Caleb Rourke 2 years ago." She paused. "He was one of the men who disappeared." Clara's hand tightened on the pistol. "I'm listening." "Thomas, my husband, he was a good worker, loyal, but he saw things. Things Helena Graves didn't want people seeing." Anna's voice was steady, but her hands shook. "He told me about it. About the intimidation, the sabotage. He was going to report it to the territorial marshal, and then he vanished." "What kind of things did he see?" Anna reached into her coat and pulled out a worn journal. "He kept records, dates, incidents, names of other workers who'd been bought off or threatened. It's all here." Clara took the journal with hands that wanted to shake. She opened it to a random page and saw neat handwriting documenting exactly the kind of systematic harassment she'd suspected. "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because I'm leaving, taking my children east where Helena Graves can't reach us. But before I go, I wanted someone to know, someone who might actually do something with the information." Anna met Clara's eyes. "You stood up at that meeting. You said what everyone else was too afraid to say. That takes either courage or stupidity, and I'm hoping it's courage. It might be both. Either way, you're the only chance this territory has of breaking her grip. That journal is everything Thomas documented before he disappeared. Use it. Make it matter." Clara closed the journal carefully. "I will, but I need to ask. Your husband, do you know what happened to him?" Anna's expression went carefully blank. "No, and I've decided I don't want to know. Some questions don't have answers that help." She moved toward her horse. "Be careful, Miss Whitmore. Helena Graves doesn't lose gracefully, and she doesn't lose at all if she can help it." "Neither do I." Anna almost smiled. "Then maybe you have a chance." She rode away, leaving Clara alone with a journal full of proof and the weight of what it meant. This was it. The evidence they needed. Names, dates, incidents, all documented by someone who'd paid the ultimate price for seeing too much. Clara could take this to the territorial marshal, could make an official complaint, could force an investigation that Helena couldn't simply buy off or intimidate away. But that would take time, and time was something they didn't have. The loan payment was due in 10 days. The ranch was still hemorrhaging money faster than they could earn it. And now that Clara had made herself a target, Helena would escalate. She had to. Clara rode back to meet Caleb, her mind already working through possibilities, strategies, risks. The journal felt heavy in her satchel, full of dead man's truths and dangerous possibilities. "Well?" Caleb asked when she appeared. "We have proof. Real proof. Everything we suspected, and more." "That's good. And it's also bad because now we have to figure out what to do with it." Clara handed him the journal. "We can go to the authorities, start an official investigation, but that could take months, and we don't have months. Or we can use it differently." "How?" Clara's smile was sharp enough to cut. "We make Helena Graves an offer she can't refuse." The plan was insane, which was probably why Caleb didn't immediately talk her out of it. They sat at the kitchen table that night, the journal spread between them like evidence at a trial. Iris had read through it twice, her face growing harder with each page. Now she stood by the window, her usual post, but her posture was different, ready instead of waiting. You want to blackmail Helena Graves, Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. I want to negotiate from a position of strength, Clara corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Blackmail implies I'm trying to extract something illegal. I'm just proposing a business arrangement she'll find motivating. Iris turned from the window. What exactly are you proposing? Clara had been working through this since leaving the Miller property, turning it over in her mind until the edges were sharp. We offer her a choice. She backs off, stops the sabotage, stops the intimidation, leaves us alone to run our business. And we keep this journal private. We don't go to the territorial marshal. We don't make noise. We just coexist. And if she refuses, Caleb asked, then we take this to every newspaper between here and Denver. We make it public. We make it loud. And we make damn sure that when the territorial authorities investigate, they find everything Thomas Reeves documented and more. She'll destroy us before we get the chance. Maybe, but she'll also destroy herself in the process. That's the thing about monopolies built on intimidation. They only work when nobody's paying attention. The minute people start looking closely, start asking questions, the whole structure becomes fragile. Clara tapped the journal. This is leverage, real leverage, and we're going to use it. Caleb ran his hands through his hair, making it stand up in directions that would have been comical under different circumstances. This is beyond risky, Clara. This is betting everything on Helena Graves caring more about her reputation than she does about winning. No, it's betting that she's a businesswoman first, and businesswomen understand cost-benefit analysis. Clara leaned forward. Right now, crushing us is easy and low risk. But if we make it expensive, if we make it public and messy and complicated, then suddenly we're not worth the trouble. Suddenly, leaving us alone becomes the smarter play. Or she decides to make an example out of us. She might, but I don't think she will. Clara had been studying Helena Graves the way you'd study an opponent across a card table, looking for tells and patterns. Everything I've heard about her suggests she's calculating, strategic. She doesn't act out of anger, she acts out of efficiency. And there's nothing efficient about a public fight that draws outside attention to her operation. Iris moved to the table, her hands flat on the worn wood. When do you want to do this? Tomorrow, before she makes her next move, before we lose our nerve or our opportunity. Clara looked between them. I need to know you're both with me on this, because once I walk into her office with these accusations, there's no taking it back. I'm with you, Iris said immediately. I've been silent too long. Watching too long. If you're going to fight, then I'm fighting too. Caleb took longer, his face working through calculations Clara couldn't follow. Finally, he nodded. All right, but I'm coming with you. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. This is my ranch, my fight. And if we're making a stand, then I'm standing too. He met her eyes. Besides, you'll need a witness. Someone who can back up what you said if things go badly. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to keep him safe from the consequences of her choices, but she also understood that he needed this, needed to be part of his own salvation instead of just watching from the sidelines. Fine, we go together, but we do it my way. What way is that? Smart, careful, and ready to run if necessary. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Clara made copies of the most damning pages in Thomas Reeves's journal, her handwriting cramping as she transcribed dates and incidents and names. Iris packed supplies, food, water, clothes wrapped in oilcloth, and hid them in 3 different locations around the property, just in case they needed to disappear quickly. Caleb cleaned his rifle and said nothing, but his hands were steady. By dawn, they were as ready as they'd ever be. Clara dressed in her best clothes, the dark dress she'd worn to her father's funeral, mended and remended until it was more stitching than original fabric. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw someone who'd stopped apologizing for existing. You look like you're going to war, Iris said from the doorway. I am. Then you look perfect. They rode to town through morning light that painted everything gold and indifferent. The streets were mostly empty, just a few early risers heading to work or opening shops. Clara had been to Helena Graves' office once before, weeks ago, to understand what she was facing. The building was the finest in town, 2 stories of imported brick and ambition, with windows that actually had glass and a door that didn't stick. A monument to power, built in a place where most people lived in structures one bad storm away from collapse. Clara tied her horse to the rail and looked up at those windows. Somewhere behind them, Helena Graves was probably already working, already planning, already 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Well, Clara had moves too. "Ready?" Caleb asked. "No, but we're doing it anyway." The interior was just as impressive as the exterior. Polished floors, furniture that looked like it had been shipped from back east, paintings on walls that would have sold for more than most ranches. A secretary sat at a desk near the entrance, a thin man with spectacles who looked up with the expression of someone perpetually annoyed by interruptions. "We need to see Miss Graves," Clara said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but she'll want to see us anyway. Tell her Clara Whitmore is here regarding Thomas Reeves." The secretary's expression flickered, just for a moment, but Clara caught it. Recognition, maybe concern. "Wait here." He disappeared up a staircase, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet space. Clara and Caleb stood in the entryway like supplicants at a temple, waiting for an audience with someone who held all the power. Except that wasn't quite true anymore. They had power too, folded in Clara's satchel. Information, proof. The kind of thing that could shift balances if played correctly. The secretary returned. "Miss Graves will see you. 2nd floor, 1st door on the right." They climbed the stairs together, their boots loud on wood that probably cost more per square foot than Clara had earned in her entire life. The hallway at the top was lined with more paintings, more evidence of wealth and taste and the ability to buy anything. The door to Helena's office was open. The woman behind the desk was not what Clara expected. She'd imagined someone harsh, severe, built from angles and authority. Instead, Helena Graves looked almost delicate, small-framed, with dark hair pulled back simply, and eyes that were disturbingly intelligent. She was maybe 50, dressed in clothes that were expensive without being showy, and when she looked up at Clara, there was no surprise in her expression. She'd been expecting this. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Rourke, please sit." Helena gestured to 2 chairs positioned in front of her desk. Everything about the setup was calculated, the height of the chairs slightly lower than hers, the positioning that put the light behind her. Power dynamics, made physical. Clara sat anyway. Caleb followed her lead. "I assume this isn't a social call," Helena said, her voice surprisingly warm. Like they were old friends catching up instead of enemies meeting for battle. "No," Clara agreed. "We're here to discuss your campaign against the Rourke Ranch." "My campaign?" Helena's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite an accusation." "It's an observation, one supported by evidence." Clara pulled the journal from her satchel and set it on the desk between them. Thomas Reeves kept records, very detailed records, of everything he witnessed while working for Mr. Rourke. The intimidation, the sabotage, the systematic destruction of anyone who wouldn't sell to you. Helena didn't reach for the journal, didn't even look at it. She just kept her eyes on Clara, studying her with the focus of someone evaluating a new piece on a chessboard. "Thomas Reeves disappeared 2 years ago," Helena said finally. "Tragic situation. His wife moved away, as I recall, after you made sure her husband couldn't testify to what he'd seen. That's a serious allegation. Do you have proof?" "I have this journal. I have witness statements. I have a pattern of behavior spanning 3 years and 5 different ranchers, all of whom experienced mysterious problems right before selling to you." Clara leaned forward. "And I have the attention of the territorial marshal, who I'm sure would be very interested in investigating monopolistic practices and potential violence." Something shifted in Helena's expression. Not fear, Clara doubted this woman feared much, but calculation, a reassessment of the situation. "What do you want?" Helena asked. "I want you to leave us alone. Stop the sabotage. Stop the intimidation. Let us run our business without interference." Clara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "In exchange, this journal stays private. We don't go to the authorities. We don't make noise. We just coexist. And if I refuse? Then I take this to every newspaper within 100 miles. I make it public and loud and impossible to ignore. And even if you destroy me in the process, the damage to your reputation will be permanent. Territorial authorities will investigate. Business partners will ask questions. Everything you've built will be examined under a microscope, and I'm betting there are things you'd rather keep hidden. Helena sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, but Clara refused to break it. This was a negotiation, and the first person to speak usually lost. Helena spoke first. "You're interesting, Miss Whitmore. Most people who walk into this office are either trying to sell me something or begging for mercy. You're doing neither. I'm proposing a business arrangement, one that benefits both of us. How does allowing you to continue interfering with my operations benefit me? Because we're not actually interfering. We're serving a market you've been neglecting. Workers who want better food, ranchers who want alternatives. We're small, insignificant in the grand scheme of your empire." Clara kept her voice level. "Crushing us would be easy, but it would also be expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money, public attention, outside scrutiny, questions about how you've built your monopoly. That's what I'm offering to prevent. By threatening to expose me if I don't comply. By offering you the option to avoid a fight neither of us wants." Helena studied her for another long moment, then reached for the journal. She opened it, scanning pages with an expression that gave nothing away. Clara watched her read Thomas Reeves's careful documentation of crimes and calculated cruelty, watched for any sign of reaction. There was none. Finally, Helena closed the journal and pushed it back across the desk. "This proves nothing. It's one man's account, uncorroborated, collected by someone with clear bias. No court would consider it evidence." Maybe not, but newspapers don't require the same standard of proof, and public opinion is harder to control than legal proceedings. Clara didn't touch the journal. "You've spent years building an image, successful businesswoman, pillar of the community, someone who earned her position through intelligence and hard work. How long does that image survive if people start asking how many accidents and disappearances are connected to your expansion? You're assuming people would believe you over me. I'm assuming people want to believe someone. And a desperate woman with nothing to lose makes for a much more compelling story than a wealthy landowner protecting her interests." Helena's laugh was unexpected, genuine and almost delighted. "You really are remarkable. Where did Caleb find you?" "I found him, actually." "Of course you did." Helena stood, walking to the window that overlooked the town she essentially owned. "Tell me something, Miss Whitmore. What makes you think you can win this fight? Even if you expose me, even if you generate sympathy and outrage, I still control the resources, the land, the business, the connections. You have a journal and audacity. That's not enough. It's enough to make you bleed, and sometimes that's all you need, to prove that someone can be hurt. Once people see that, once they understand you're not invincible, everything changes." "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I've spent my whole life being underestimated, learning to turn weakness into weapons. You're powerful, Miss Graves, maybe even untouchable, but powerful people have more to lose, which means they have more to protect." Clara stood as well, facing Helena across the expensive office. "I'm offering you the chance to protect it without a fight. That seems generous, considering." Helena turned from the window, and for the first time, Clara saw something other than calculation in her expression. Respect, maybe. Or recognition, one fighter acknowledging another. "You have courage, I'll give you that. Stupidity too, but courage nonetheless." Helena moved back to her desk, her movements precise. "Here's my counteroffer. You stop this food business. You stop interfering with my operations, and I'll release Mr. Rourke from his debts and allow him to keep his ranch. He can live there quietly until he dies or decides to sell voluntarily. No more sabotage. No more pressure. A clean ending. And what about everyone else? The other ranchers, the workers, the people who want alternatives to your monopoly? They accept reality. The same reality you should accept. That this territory operates according to certain rules, and I write those rules." Clara shook her head. "No deal. We keep the business. You leave us alone. That's the only arrangement I'm interested in." "Then you're a fool." "Maybe. But I'm a fool with evidence and nothing to lose, which makes me dangerous in ways you're not used to dealing with." Helena's expression hardened. "You think you're the first person to threaten me? To think they could challenge my authority? Let me tell you what happens to people like you, Miss Whitmore. They lose. They always lose. Because at the end of the day, power isn't about who's right or who's clever or who has the moral high ground. It's about who can afford to outlast the other person. And I can afford anything. We'll see. Clara picked up this journal, tucked it back in her satchel, and turned toward the door. Caleb followed, his face pale but determined. "Miss Whitmore," Helena called after her, "you're making a mistake." Clara looked back. "Probably. But it's my mistake to make." They left the office, walked down the stairs past the annoyed secretary, and made it to their horses before Clara's hands started shaking. "That went well," Caleb said, his voice strangled somewhere between terror and hysteria. "She didn't kill us. I'm calling that a win." "She didn't agree to anything either." "No, but she's thinking about it. Did you see her face when I mentioned the newspapers? She's worried about exposure, about scrutiny. That's leverage." Clara mounted her horse, her hands still trembling slightly. "We just have to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." "Which is what exactly?" "Escalation. She's going to test us. Push harder. See if we break. We need to be ready to push back." They rode out of town in silence, both aware that they'd just crossed another line. The meeting hadn't gone badly. They were still alive, still free. But it hadn't gone well either. Helena hadn't backed down, hadn't agreed to anything. She'd just acknowledged the fight was real, which meant the real war was about to start. Back at the ranch, Iris was waiting with more bad news. 2 workers came by while you were gone, railroad supervisors. They wanted to cancel the next supply order. Clara felt her stomach drop. Did they say why? They didn't have to. I could see it in their faces. Someone got to them, threatened them or paid them off, or both. "Helena," Caleb said flatly, "she's cutting off our income, forcing us back into debt." Clara paced the kitchen, her mind racing through implications and options. Without the supply contracts, they had no income stream beyond the minimal sales to Ruth and Sam, not enough to cover the loan payment, let alone rebuild from the barn fire. "We need to contact the mining camps directly," Clara said. "Go around the supervisors, sell straight to the workers." "That'll take time we don't have. The loan payment is due in 8 days. Then we make time. We push harder, work longer, find another way." Clara stopped pacing, her decision made. "I'm going to the camps tomorrow, with or without supervisor approval. If the workers want to buy, they can buy directly." "That's dangerous," Iris said. "If Helena finds out, she already knows everything we're doing. Might as well do it anyway." That night, Clara barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at ceiling boards she could map in the dark, thinking through scenarios and consequences. Helena Graves was smarter than Clara had hoped, more ruthless than she'd feared. This wasn't going to be a quick fight or a clean one. It was going to be brutal, but Clara had been preparing for brutal her entire life. The next morning, she loaded what supplies they could spare into a borrowed wagon and headed for the railroad camps alone. Caleb had wanted to come, but someone needed to stay at the ranch in case Helena made another move. Iris rode shotgun, literally, Caleb's rifle across her lap, loaded and ready. "You know how to use that?" Clara asked. "I was married for 23 years. You learn things." They reached the first camp by mid-morning. The supervisor, the same one who'd bought from them before, stood at the entrance like a guard, his expression apologetic but firm. "Can't let you in, Miss Whitmore. Orders." "From who?" "You know from who." Clara studied him, reading the fear and regret in equal measure. "What did she offer you?" "Contract renewal, better pay for the crews, investment in safety equipment." He shrugged. "Everything we've been asking for, suddenly available. All we had to do was stop buying from you." So she's buying loyalty now. That's new. That's business. And I've got 200 men depending on me to make smart decisions. I'm sorry, but you're not worth losing everything we've gained. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to point out that they were just trading one form of dependence for another. But she also understood survival made people practical in ways morality couldn't compete with. "Can I at least talk to the workers? Let them decide for themselves." "They've already decided. Helena's prices just dropped to match yours. No point buying from you when they can get the same thing from her without the political complications." Clara felt the trap closing. Helena had outmaneuvered her, using money and influence to eliminate the one advantage Clara had built. She'd made competition obsolete by simply absorbing the market. "Smart," Clara admitted. "Expensive, but smart." She can afford expensive. Can you? The answer to that was obvious. They tried 2 more camps with the same result. Helena had gotten there first, had offered enough incentives that loyalty became unnecessary. By the time they turned the wagon toward home, Clara's carefully constructed business was in ruins. "What now?" Iris asked. "I don't know." It was the first time Clara had admitted that out loud, and saying it felt like defeat. They rode in silence, the wagon empty except for supplies no one wanted. The sun was setting by the time the ranch came into view, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow that felt almost mocking. Caleb met them at the barn, his expression asking questions he didn't voice. "She beat us," Clara said simply. "Undercut our prices, bought off the supervisors, made us obsolete. It's over. The loan payment, we can't make it, not without the supply contracts." They stood together in the dying light, 3 people who'd fought as hard as they could and still come up short. Clara felt exhaustion settling into her bones, the kind that came from pushing past limits only to find out limits existed for a reason. "I'm sorry," she said. "I pushed too hard, made too much noise, and now we adapt," Iris interrupted. "This isn't over, Clara. It's just different than we planned." "How?" "We're out of money, out of customers, out of options. The loan payment is due in a week, and we've got nothing." Iris looked toward the house, her expression thoughtful. "We have the journal, we have proof, and we have one move Helena hasn't anticipated yet." "What move?" "We stop trying to beat her at business and start fighting dirty. We take this to the newspapers like you threatened. We make it public and messy and let the consequences fall where they will." Caleb shook his head. "That'll destroy us too. We expose her. She destroys the ranch out of spite. We lose everything." "We're losing everything anyway," Iris pointed out. "At least this way we take her down with us." Clara looked between them, seeing the same exhaustion she felt reflected in their faces. They'd tried to be smart, tried to be strategic, and Helena had crushed them anyway because she had resources they couldn't match and ruthlessness they couldn't stomach. Maybe it was time to match it. "All right," Clara said slowly. "We go to the newspapers. We expose everything, but we do it right. We make copies of the journal. We send it to multiple papers simultaneously so she can't suppress them all. We make it impossible for her to contain." "And then?" Caleb asked. "And then we see who's still standing when the dust settles." It wasn't a good plan. It was barely a plan at all, more like controlled demolition, taking everything down and hoping to survive the collapse. But it was all they had left. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table and began writing. Not copies of the journal, they'd do that tomorrow, but a letter, a statement, an explanation of everything that had happened, everything they'd witnessed, everything they could prove. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes burned and the words stopped making sense. And then she wrote more because stopping meant admitting defeat, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Iris found her at dawn, slumped over papers covered in cramped handwriting. "You need sleep. I need to finish this." "Clara." Iris's hand on her shoulder was gentle but firm. "You can't fight if you collapse from exhaustion. Rest. The battle will still be here in a few hours." Clara wanted to argue, but her body agreed with her mother. She stumbled to her bed and fell into sleep that was more like unconsciousness, too tired even to dream. She woke to shouting. Clara was on her feet before she was fully conscious, running toward the noise. She found Caleb in the yard, arguing with a man on horseback. Marcus Fell, Helena's business manager, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "But, final offer," Marcus was saying. "Miss Graves is willing to pay off the loan and give Mr. Rourke $500 to vacate the property. It's more than generous, considering." "Considering you've spent months destroying everything we built?" Clara stepped forward, her hair wild from sleep, but her voice steady. "That's not generous. That's adding insult to injury." "Miss Whitmore, I was hoping you'd be here." Marcus pulled an envelope from his coat. "Miss Graves asked me to give you this. A personal message." Clara took the envelope warily. Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper with one sentence. "Last chance. Take the money or face the consequences." She looked up at Marcus. "Tell Helena Graves she can take her money and her threats and—" "Actually," Caleb interrupted, his voice strange. "Tell her we'll take it. Clara spun to face him. What? We'll take her offer. $500 and the loan paid off. We'll be gone by the end of the week. Caleb, no. Excellent decision, Marcus said quickly, before Clara could finish. I'll have the papers drawn up. You can sign them tomorrow. He rode off, leaving Clara and Caleb standing in the yard like survivors of something neither had expected to survive. What are you doing? Clara demanded. We were going to fight. We were going to expose her. And we still will, but not by destroying ourselves in the process. Caleb's expression was calm in a way that made Clara nervous. I've been thinking about what you said, about making her bleed, about proving she can be hurt. So? So we take her money, we sign her papers, and then, after we're safely away from here, after we're beyond her immediate reach, we release everything to the newspapers. We expose her when she thinks she's won. Clara stared at him, understanding dawning. We make her pay for our silence, and then we talk anyway. Exactly. She gets what she thinks she wants. The ranch, the water rights, the victory. And we get to walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. But we also make sure everyone knows what she did to get it. It was dishonest, manipulative, exactly the kind of ruthless calculation that Clara had been trying to avoid. It was also brilliant. She'll come after us, Clara said. Maybe, but we'll be gone. And the story will be out. The damage will be done. Caleb looked toward the house, toward the land he'd been prepared to die defending. I'm tired of losing, Clara. Tired of watching everything I care about get destroyed. If this is the only way to win, even partially, then I'll take it. Clara thought about objections, about honor and integrity, and fighting clean. Then she thought about burned barns and poisoned cattle and workers who'd disappeared. She thought about Helena Graves sitting in her expensive office, confident in her power and her ability to crush anyone who challenged her. All right, Clara said, we do it your way, but we do it right. We get everything in writing, we secure the money before we sign anything, and we make sure we have escape routes planned before we release the story. Agreed. They spent the rest of the day planning their exit like generals planning a retreat. Iris organized supplies and mapped routes east. Caleb reviewed the property papers, making sure the deal Helena was offering was real. And Clara copied the journal one final time, preparing packets for 3 different newspapers in 3 different territories. By evening, they had something resembling a strategy. It felt wrong, leaving instead of fighting, running instead of standing. But it also felt like survival, and Clara had learned that survival was nothing to be ashamed of. That night, she stood on the porch looking out at land she'd never owned but had defended anyway. The ranch looked peaceful in the moonlight, almost prosperous, if you didn't know what was dying beneath the surface. Regrets? Iris asked, joining her. Dozens. But none that matter. We could still stay, could still fight the way we planned. Clara shook her head. Caleb's right. This way, we survive and we win, just not the way I wanted. Is any victory ever what we want? Probably not. They stood together in the darkness, 2 women who'd spent their lives learning to bend without breaking. Tomorrow they'd sign papers that made Helena Graves the legal victor. But in a few weeks, when the newspapers ran stories about corruption and intimidation and systematic destruction of anyone who challenged the most powerful woman in the territory, that victory would taste bitter. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even revenge. But it was something. And right now, something was more than they'd started with. The signing was scheduled for noon the next day at Helena's office. But Clara woke at dawn with a knot in her stomach that felt like premonition. She found Caleb already up, standing in the barn doorway and staring at nothing. The structure was still half ruined from the fire, skeletal and accusing in the early light. Second thoughts? Clara asked. 3rd, 4th, and 5th. He didn't look at her. This ranch has been in my family for 18 years. My father built it from nothing. My wife left because I chose it over her, and now I'm selling it to the woman who destroyed it, then running away like a coward. You're surviving. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now it feels like I'm just teaching Helena Graves that she can do whatever she wants as long as she's willing to pay for it afterward. Clara moved to stand beside him, looking at the same broken barn, the same damaged land. You want to know what I think? I think your father would understand. I think your wife would understand. Because staying here and dying for principle doesn't help anyone. But leaving alive, exposing what happened, making sure other people know what she did, that's worth something. It's not enough. No. But it's what we have. They stood in silence until Iris called them for breakfast. Eggs from the chickens that hadn't been killed, bread from flour they could barely afford. A last meal in a place that had almost become home. "I've been thinking," Iris said as they ate, "about the newspaper plan. We send those packets today. They won't run the stories for weeks, maybe months. That's a long time for Helena to figure out what we did and come after us." "What are you suggesting?" Clara asked. "I'm suggesting we need insurance. Something that makes sure the story gets out, even if something happens to us." Caleb set down his fork. "Like what?" "Like we don't just send it to newspapers. We send copies to the territorial governor's office, to federal marshals, to anyone with the authority to investigate, along with a statement that if anything happens to us, any accidents, any disappearances, they should look closely at Helena Graves." It was paranoid. It was also smart. Clara spent the morning copying the journal again, her hand cramping around the pen until her fingers went numb. She wrote out statements and accusations, documented everything they knew and everything they suspected. By the time she was done, she had 6 separate packets ready to mail. "This feels excessive," she said, sealing the last envelope. "Excessive would be 7, Iris replied. 6 is just thorough." They mailed the packets from 3 different towns, splitting up to avoid being seen together. Clara took 2 to a settlement 15 miles east. Iris took 2 south. Caleb handled the remaining 2, heading north toward the mining camps. They met back at the ranch with an hour to spare before the signing. Clara changed into her funeral dress again, the one that had become her armor. She pinned her hair back tight and looked at herself in the small mirror, seeing someone who'd learned to lose strategically. "Ready?" Iris asked from the doorway. "I hate that word." "Me too, but we're doing it anyway." They rode to town together, 3 people on 2 horses, carrying nothing but the weight of what they were about to do. The streets were busier than usual. Word had spread somehow that Caleb Rourke was finally selling, that Helena Graves had won another victory. People watched them pass with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction to something that might have been relief that it wasn't them. Helena's office looked exactly the same as it had days before, but everything felt different. This time, they were walking in to surrender. Marcus Fell met them at the door, his smile genuine for once. "Right on time. Miss Graves is waiting upstairs." They climbed the familiar stairs, walked the familiar hallway. But when they entered the office, Clara stopped short. Helena wasn't alone. A man stood by the window, dressed in the kind of suit that meant either wealth or authority. He turned as they entered, and Clara recognized him from newspaper sketches. Benjamin Wade, territorial governor. "Mr. Rourke." "Miss Whitmore," Helena said, her tone pleasant. "I hope you don't mind, but I've invited Governor Wade to witness our transaction. I thought having an official presence would ensure everything is handled properly." It was a power play, and a brilliant one. Having the governor present meant they couldn't back out, couldn't change the terms, couldn't do anything except sign the papers and smile. "Of course," Clara managed. "The more witnesses, the better." Governor Wade studied them with the expression of a man who'd seen every kind of negotiation and trusted none of them. "Miss Graves tells me you're selling voluntarily. That true?" "Voluntarily is an interesting word," Clara said before Caleb could answer. "But yes, we've agreed to her terms." "And those terms are fair?" "Fair is also an interesting word, but they're acceptable." Wade's eyes narrowed slightly, like he'd heard what she wasn't saying, but he didn't push. Instead, he moved to the desk where papers were already laid out, reviewed them briefly, then nodded. "Everything appears to be in order. Mr. Rourke, if you'll sign here, here, and here. Miss Whitmore, you'll need to witness as the household representative." They signed. Clara's hand was steady as she wrote her name, even though her stomach felt like it was trying to escape through her throat. Caleb's signature was less steady, the letters shaking slightly. Helena signed last, her movements precise and satisfied. Then she pushed a bank draft across the desk. $500, plus documentation that the loan had been paid in full. "Pleasure doing business with you," she said, and there was triumph in her voice. "I'm sure it was," Clara replied. They left with the money and the cancellation papers, walking down the stairs in silence. Marcus held the door for them, still smiling. The governor had already disappeared, his purpose served. On the street, Caleb stopped and looked back at the building that represented everything they'd lost. "It's done," he said. "Yes. We're homeless now, landless. Everything I had is gone." Clara gripped his arm. "You have $500 in your life. That's more than some people get. And in a few weeks, everyone will know what she did to get your land. That's worth something too." "Is it?" She didn't have a good answer for that. They spent the night at Ruth's boarding house. The irony of paying rent to someone who bought eggs from them wasn't lost on Clara. Ruth seemed uncomfortable having them there, like association with failure was contagious. "How long are you staying?" she asked, serving dinner that tasted like obligation. "Just tonight. We're leaving tomorrow." "Where to?" "East, maybe Denver. Somewhere far from here." Ruth nodded, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "Probably for the best. This territory's got its own way of doing things. People who don't fit that way, they tend to have trouble." "Is that advice or observation?" "Both." Clara ate in silence, tasting the unspoken judgment in every bite. They'd fought and lost, which made them either foolish or unfortunate or both. Either way, they were cautionary tales now, examples of what happened when you challenge the wrong people. She lay awake that night in a rented bed, listening to the sounds of a town that had never been theirs. Iris and Caleb were in separate rooms, each probably doing the same thing, staring at ceilings and wondering if they'd made the right choice. They left before dawn, trying to avoid goodbyes and questions and the weight of being watched. But Martha from the general store was already up, sweeping the front step of a building she didn't own, working for a woman who controlled everything. "Heard you're leaving," Martha said, not stopping her sweeping. "Word travels fast." "Always does, especially when Helena wants it to." Martha paused, finally looking up. "For what it's worth, I hope you make trouble for her wherever you land. Someone should." It was the closest thing to support Clara had heard since arriving in this territory. She took it like the gift it was. "We will. Count on it." They rode east as the sun came up, 3 people with everything they owned packed into saddlebags and determination. The land stretched before them, indifferent and vast, full of possibility and threat in equal measure. They made it 20 miles before Clara realized they were being followed. She spotted the riders first, a distant shape that appeared whenever the road crested a hill, disappearing when the terrain gave cover. Too consistent to be coincidence, too careful to be innocent. "We've got company," she said quietly. Caleb checked behind them without being obvious about it. "One rider, staying back. Helena's insurance policy, making sure we actually leave. Or making sure we have an accident before we get too far." That thought had occurred to Clara too. They'd mailed the packets, had created their insurance, but insurance only worked if people knew to use it. If something happened to them in the middle of nowhere, it might be weeks before anyone noticed, months before anyone connected it to Helena Graves. "We need to get somewhere public," Iris said. "Somewhere with witnesses." The nearest town was another 15 miles. They pushed the horses harder than they should have, watching the rider behind them maintain his distance. He didn't approach, didn't threaten, just followed, patient and inevitable. They reached the town just before noon. It was smaller than the one they'd left, barely more than a trading post and a few buildings clustered around a crossroads. But it had people, and people meant safety. Clara pulled up in front of what looked like a saloon and dismounted quickly. "Stay visible. Don't let him catch us alone." The rider appeared at the edge of town minutes later. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. Right now, he was thinking he'd lost the advantage. He tied his horse and walked into the saloon like he had business there. Clara followed, making sure Caleb and Iris were behind her. Inside, the place was mostly empty, a bartender wiping glasses, 2 men playing cards in the corner. The rider ordered whiskey and took it to a table where he could watch the door. Clara walked straight to him. "You're not subtle," she said. He looked up, startled. "Don't know what you mean." "You've been following us for 20 miles. Either you're the world's worst tracker or you wanted us to know. So which is it?" The young man's hand moved toward his belt. Not a gun, Clara noticed, but a knife. Amateur hour. "Miss Graves wants to make sure you leave the territory. I'm making sure you leave." "We are leaving," You can report back that we're headed east and not planning to return. I'll report when I'm satisfied you're gone for good. Clara pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. Here's the thing about following people. It only works if they don't know you're there. Now that we know, now that everyone in this room has seen your face and heard you mention Helena Graves's name, you're not an anonymous tale anymore. You're a witness. And if anything happens to us between here and Denver, the territorial marshals are going to be very interested in why one of Helena's men was following us. The young man's confidence wavered. I'm not going to hurt you, just making sure we're scared enough to stay quiet. Well, consider us scared. We're leaving. We're not coming back. Mission accomplished. Clara stood. But do me a favor. Tell Helena that having us killed won't stop what's already in motion. The letters are mailed. The evidence is distributed. And if we disappear mysteriously, that just adds credibility to everything we've said. She left before he could respond, her heart hammering but her walk steady. Caleb and Iris followed her out into sunlight that felt too bright. That was risky, Caleb said. Everything we've done has been risky. At least now he knows killing us would be counterproductive. They remounted and rode east again, faster this time. The young man didn't follow, Clara checked obsessively, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Helena's reach was longer than 20 miles, longer than this territory. Money and influence didn't respect borders or distance. They stopped for the night at another small town, paying for rooms they couldn't afford and sleeping in shifts. Clara took first watch, sitting by the window with Caleb's rifle across her lap and watching shadows that might have been threats or might have been paranoia. Iris relieved her at midnight. Get some rest. You can't stay awake forever. I can try. Clara. Her mother's hand on her shoulder was firm. You did everything you could. You fought harder than anyone expected. But you can't control what happens next. You can only control how you respond when it does. And if Helena finds a way to kill the story, to suppress the newspapers or buy off the editors or discredit us before anyone takes us seriously, then we tried. That's more than most people do. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that trying wasn't enough. But exhaustion was making her thoughts fuzzy and her eyes heavy. She stumbled to the bed and fell asleep still dressed, too tired even to remove her boots. She woke to morning light and Caleb shaking her shoulder. Clara, you need to see this. He handed her a newspaper, not from their territory, but from Denver, 200 miles east. The date was recent, and on the front page, below a story about railroad expansion, was a small headline, Territorial Monopoly Under Investigation. Clara's hands shook as she read. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs, but it mentioned Helena Graves by name, mentioned allegations of intimidation and market manipulation, mentioned that territorial authorities were reviewing evidence provided by anonymous sources. How? Clara whispered. We just mailed those packets 3 days ago. Read the byline, Caleb said. Clara looked. The reporter's name was familiar, Thomas Reeves, Jr. His son, she breathed. Anna must have contacted him before she left, must have given him copies of the journal. He beat us to it, published before Helena could suppress it. Clara read the article again, letting the implications sink in. This changed everything. The story was already out, already public. Helena couldn't stop it now. She could only try to control the damage. And damage control meant leaving them alone. Killing them or silencing them would just confirm the allegations, would turn suspicion into certainty. We're safe, Clara said, still not quite believing it. Maybe, for now. Caleb took the paper back, studying the article like it might change if he looked away. But Helena's not going to forget this. Not going to forgive it. No. But she's going to have bigger problems than us. Territorial investigations, federal scrutiny, business partners asking questions. We're not worth her attention anymore. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like survival, messy and incomplete, and nothing like Clara had imagined. They continued east anyway, putting more distance between themselves and the territory that had nearly destroyed them. Each town they passed through felt safer, each mile like breathing room. They bought another newspaper in a settlement near the Colorado border and found a longer article, this one detailing specific allegations, quoting from what had to be Thomas Reeves's journal. Helena Graves was fighting back. Clara could see it in the quoted denials, the claims of business as usual, the suggestions that disgruntled former employees were spreading lies. But the investigation was real. Authorities were asking questions. The machinery of justice, slow and imperfect as it was, had started moving. "Think she'll go to prison?" Iris asked, reading over Clara's shoulder. "People like Helena don't go to prison. They pay fines and issue apologies and restructure their businesses. But her reputation is damaged. Her monopoly is broken. That's something. Is it enough? It'll have to be." They reached Denver a week later, arriving in a city that felt impossibly large after months in territories where towns were barely crossroads. The noise and crowds and sheer density of people was overwhelming in ways both terrifying and liberating. No one here knew them. No one cared about a failed ranch or a cattle baron or a fight they'd barely survived. They were anonymous in the best possible way, free to reinvent themselves without the weight of history. Caleb found work at a livestock yard, leveraging the only skills he had. It paid poorly but regularly, which was more than the ranch had ever offered. Iris took in mending, her quick fingers and careful stitching earning reputation and repeat customers. And Clara started looking for something else entirely. She found it in a boarding house dining room, watching the owner struggle with supply orders and inventory management. The woman, a sharp-eyed widow named Eleanor, was smart but overworked, trying to run the business alone after her husband's death. "You need help," Clara said after 3 days of observation. Eleanor looked up from ledgers that were more chaos than accounting. "Can't afford help." "You can't afford not to have help. You're losing money because your ordering is inefficient. You're paying too much for supplies because you're not buying in bulk. You're undercharging for rooms because you don't know what the market will bear." Clara pulled out a chair and sat. "I can fix all of that." "You know bookkeeping?" "I know business. Learned it from failure, which is the best teacher there is." Eleanor studied her with the expression of someone who'd learned to evaluate people quickly and trust seldom. "What do you want in return?" 20% of whatever profit increase I generate in the first 6 months. After that, we renegotiate." "That's aggressive." "That's confident. I know I can improve your margins. Question is whether you're willing to let me prove it." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, then pushed the ledgers across the table. "Show me what you see." Clara showed her. Showed her the inefficiencies and the missed opportunities. Showed her how small changes in ordering and pricing could compound into significant profit. Showed her that running a business wasn't about working harder. It was about working smarter. By the end of the week, Clara had a job. By the end of the month, Eleanor's profits were up 18%. By the end of 3 months, Clara was managing the entire operation while Eleanor focused on expansion plans. "You're wasted here," Eleanor said one evening, reviewing numbers that had transformed from barely breaking even to genuinely profitable. "You should be running your own business." "Maybe someday. For now, this is enough." And it was. Not the life Clara had imagined, not the victory she'd wanted, but it was honest work that used her skills and paid enough to live on. It was a room of her own and food that didn't taste like desperation. It was the freedom to walk down streets without fear of who might be following. 6 months after leaving the territory, a letter arrived. Clara recognized the handwriting before she opened it. Anna Reeves, writing from somewhere in Kansas. The letter was brief. "Miss Whitmore, thank you. The investigation continues. Helena Graves has been forced to sell several properties and restructure her businesses. The monopoly is broken. My son's article started it, but your courage finished it. Thomas would have been proud. I hope you found peace wherever you landed." Clara read it twice, then tucked it away in a drawer with the other remnants of that life. She didn't frame it or display it. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that sometimes winning looked nothing like you expected. That night, she stood on the boarding house roof and looked west toward territories she'd never see again. Somewhere out there, Helena Graves was dealing with consequences, and Clara was here, alive and free, and building something that couldn't be taken by force or intimidation. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even revenge. But it was survival. And survival, Clara had learned, was its own kind of victory. She stayed on the roof until the stars came out, mapping constellations she'd learned as a child, and wondering if Caleb was looking at the same sky. Wondering if Iris was sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. wondering if any of them regretted the choices that had brought them here. Clara didn't. Not really. She'd gone to that ranch expecting nothing and found a fight worth having. She'd lost everything except what mattered: her life, her mother, her refusal to disappear quietly. Those were worth more than land or victory or the satisfaction of seeing enemies defeated. Those were worth surviving for. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of city smoke and possibility. Somewhere below, Eleanor was probably working on expansion plans, building an empire one careful decision at a time. Somewhere west, Helena Graves was learning that power built on intimidation could crumble faster than power built on respect. And somewhere between those extremes, Clara had found her place. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. She climbed down from the roof as Denver's lights began to glow, returning to a world that still had problems and struggles and daily battles. But they were her problems now, her struggles, her battles. And she'd faced them the same way she'd faced everything else, with intelligence, determination, and the absolute refusal to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. It was enough. It had to be. But survival, Clara discovered, had a way of not staying simple. 3 months after Anna's letter, Eleanor came to Clara with a proposal that sounded too good to be reasonable. "I'm buying another property," Eleanor said, spreading documents across the table where they did their planning. "Bigger boarding house, better location. I want you to run it." Clara looked at the papers without touching them. "Run it how?" "However you want. Full operational control. You manage staff, handle finances, make decisions. I provide the capital and take 40% of profits. You take 60%. That's generous? That's smart business. You've tripled my income in 6 months. I'd be an idiot not to expand with you." Eleanor pushed the papers closer. "Unless you're planning to stay small forever." Clara thought about that word. Small. She'd spent her entire life being told she was too much, too opinionated, too sharp, too unwilling to soften herself for other people's comfort. And yet here was someone offering her the chance to be bigger, to take up more space, to build something that wasn't just survival, but actual success. It should have been an easy yes. "I need to think about it," Clara said. That night, she walked Denver's streets until her feet hurt, and her thoughts settled into something resembling clarity. The city had grown familiar in ways the territory never had. She knew which corners were safe, which establishments welcomed women alone, which routes would get her home before dark. She'd built a life here, small but solid, enough but not excessive. Taking Eleanor's offer meant risking that stability, meant betting on herself again after the last bet had cost her nearly everything, meant choosing ambition over safety, growth over comfort. She found herself at Caleb's boarding house without quite meaning to. He rented a room 3 blocks from hers, close enough to visit, but far enough to maintain independence. She knocked, and he answered looking tired in the way that came from physical labor rather than fear. "Clara, everything all right?" Eleanor offered me a partnership, full management of a new property. Caleb stepped aside to let her in. His room was sparse but clean, bed, chair, small table, with a book he'd probably been reading before she interrupted. Nothing like the ranch, nothing like the life he'd lost. "That's good news, isn't it?" he asked. "I don't know, is it?" Clara sat in the chair uninvited. "I keep thinking about what happened before, how we tried to build something and it got destroyed, how we fought and lost and barely escaped with our lives. And now Eleanor wants me to try again, to build something bigger, and all I can think is, what if it goes wrong again? It probably will. Most things do." Caleb leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "But you know what I learned from losing the ranch? That the trying mattered more than the outcome. We didn't win, but we fought. We stood up when we could have stayed down. That changed something in me." "What did it change?" "Made me realize that defeat isn't the same as failure. We lost the ranch, but we didn't fail. We exposed Helena. We broke her monopoly. We survived when we weren't supposed to. That's worth something." He met her eyes. "You taught me that, actually. When you showed up and refused to accept that losing was inevitable, you made me remember what it felt like to try." Clara felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "I'm scared of trying again and failing again, of proving that maybe I was just lucky before, not actually capable." "Then you'd be in good company. Everyone who's ever tried anything worthwhile has felt that." Caleb smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. Take the partnership, Clara. Build something. And if it fails, at least you'll fail doing something interesting. She left his boarding house feeling marginally less terrified, which was probably as good as it was going to get. The walk home took her past Eleanor's property. The building was dark but solid, full of potential and risk in equal measure. Clara made her decision somewhere between one step and the next, the way most important decisions probably got made. Not through careful analysis or logical deduction, but through the simple recognition that standing still was its own kind of death. She told Eleanor yes the next morning. The new boarding house opened 3 months later in the spring of 1879. Clara hired staff carefully, women mostly, ones who'd been overlooked or underestimated or told they weren't suitable for positions of responsibility. She trained them in bookkeeping and management, taught them to see problems as opportunities and obstacles as information. Within 6 months, the property was profitable. Within a year, it was thriving. Eleanor came by one afternoon to review the books, her expression pleased in the quiet way of people who'd bet correctly. "You're making me rich," she said. "I'm making us both rich. There's a difference." "Fair point." Eleanor closed the ledger with satisfaction. "What's next?" "Next? You're not the type to stop at one success, so what's the next plan? Another property? Expansion into restaurants?" "What?" Clara hadn't let herself think that far ahead, had been too focused on making the current venture work to imagine future ones. But Eleanor's question opened possibilities she'd been afraid to examine. "I want to do what we did before," Clara said slowly. "In the territory. Provide alternatives to monopolies. Give people choices they don't currently have, but do it right this time. Do it in a way that can't be easily crushed." "That's ambitious." "That's the point." They started small. Clara contracted with railroad crews passing through Denver, provided meals and supplies at fair prices. Then mining camps. Then construction crews working on the city's expansion. Each contract built reputation, built relationships, built a network of people who knew they could count on fair dealing and quality goods. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations with cattle barons, no barn burnings, no desperate fights for survival, just steady, careful growth. The kind that couldn't be destroyed by one powerful person having a bad day. But it also wasn't the fire that Clara had felt in the territory. The urgency. The sense that every decision mattered, that every day could be their last chance to prove something. She mentioned this to Iris one evening, helping her mother fold mending in the small room they still shared despite being able to afford better. "I miss it sometimes," Clara admitted. "The fighting. The feeling like what we did actually mattered." Iris paused mid-fold. "What you're doing now doesn't matter." "It matters differently. It's successful, it's profitable, it's everything I should want. But it's not. I don't know. It's not the same." "Because you're not fighting for your life every single day?" "Maybe." Iris set down the shirt she'd been working on, her hands still for once. "Clara, do you know why I stopped talking? Back in the territory when we were moving from town to town and everything kept falling apart?" Clara had wondered but never asked. "Why?" "Because I was tired of fighting, tired of the constant struggle to survive, to prove ourselves, to justify taking up space. I wanted to disappear because disappearing seemed easier than continuing to fight battles I was always going to lose." Iris looked at her daughter directly. "You brought me back. You made me remember that fighting mattered even when we lost. But fighting for survival and fighting for success are different things. One will kill you slowly. The other might actually build something. So you think I should be satisfied with this, with success instead of struggle? I think you should recognize that this is the struggle. Building something sustainable, creating opportunities for other people, proving that you can succeed without destroying yourself. That's harder than dramatic confrontations and desperate gambles. It just doesn't feel as urgent." Clara wanted to argue, but her mother had a point. The work she was doing now required different skills, patience instead of audacity, strategy instead of desperation. It was less cinematic, but more substantial. Less satisfying in the moment, but more meaningful over time. The realization didn't make the restlessness disappear, but it made it manageable. A year passed, then another. The business expanded. Clara hired more staff, opened a third property, started training other women to manage operations the way Eleanor had trained her. She built a network of people who'd been told they weren't capable and proved that assessment wrong. And she tried not to think about the territory too often, about Caleb's ranch that now belonged to someone else, about Helena Graves, whose empire had been damaged but not destroyed, about the fight they'd started but never quite finished. Then, in the summer of 1881, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was from a lawyer in Cheyenne, addressed to Caleb but forwarded to Clara when the original address proved outdated. She brought it to him at the livestock yard, interrupting his work with an apology and a sense of foreboding. Caleb read it twice, his face going carefully blank. "What is it?" Clara asked. "Helena Graves is dead, died 3 weeks ago, and apparently—" He looked up from the letter, his expression impossible to read. "Apparently she left the ranch to me in her will." Clara felt the world tilt slightly. "What?" "Says here she purchased the property from me under duress, that the transaction was invalid, that she's returning it to its rightful owner as part of settling her estate." Caleb handed Clara the letter. "This has to be some kind of trick." Clara read it carefully, looking for trapdoors and hidden clauses. But the language was straightforward. Helena Graves had died of pneumonia, had apparently spent her final months settling affairs and making amends. The ranch, plus funds for repairs and restocking, was being returned to Caleb Rourke with no strings attached. "She's trying to buy forgiveness," Clara said. "Even dead, she's trying to control the narrative. Does it matter why?" "Doesn't it?" Caleb took the letter back, staring at it like it might transform into something comprehensible. "I don't know what to do with this." "You could go back, rebuild what was destroyed, try again." "Could I? After everything that happened? After 2 years of learning to live without it?" He looked at Clara with something like desperation. "What would you do?" Clara thought about the ranch, about the land that had almost killed them, about the fight they'd barely survived, and the victory that had looked nothing like triumph. "I'd ask myself what I actually want. Not what I'm supposed to want, not what makes sense strategically, but what would make me wake up feeling like my life meant something." "And what do you want?" The question hung between them, larger than it should have been. Clara realized she'd been asking herself the same thing for 2 years without finding a satisfactory answer. The business in Denver was successful. She was respected, financially stable, building something meaningful. By every reasonable measure, she should be content. But she wasn't. Not quite. "I want to finish what we started," she said finally. "I want to go back and build something that can't be destroyed, not out of revenge or proving a point, but because that territory deserves better than one person controlling everything. It deserves alternatives and competition and the freedom to choose." Caleb nodded slowly. "Me too." They told Eleanor that evening. She took it better than expected, though her expression suggested she'd been anticipating this conversation. "You're going back," she said. Not a question. "Yes, but I'm not abandoning what we built here. I'm leaving it in capable hands." Clara had been training 3 women in management, preparing them without quite admitting why. "The business will continue. You'll continue. This isn't an ending. Just a new chapter." Something like that. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "You know, this is crazy. Going back to a place that almost killed you, trying to rebuild something that was destroyed once already. Most people would call that foolish. Most people would probably be right. But you're doing it anyway." "Yes." Eleanor smiled, and there was something proud in it. "Then I hope you build something remarkable. And when you do, send word. I might invest." They left Denver in the fall, when the air was turning cold and the mountains to the west were already dusted with snow. Iris came too, despite Clara's protests that she didn't have to, that she'd earned rest and peace and freedom from constant struggle. "You think I'm letting you go back there without me?" Iris said, packing with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. "After everything we went through to escape? I want to see what we build when we're not just trying to survive." The journey back took 2 weeks. The territory looked different in autumn light, harder somehow, less forgiving, but also familiar in ways Denver had never been. This land had tried to break them, which meant it knew them in ways civilized cities never would. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was in better condition than Clara expected. Someone, probably Helena's estate managers, had made basic repairs. The barn had been rebuilt, fences mended, the house cleaned of the worst deterioration. It wasn't thriving, but it wasn't dying either. It was waiting. Caleb stood in the yard, looking at his property like he was seeing it for the first time. "I don't know if I can do this." "Yes, you do," Clara said. "You've been doing it for 2 years in Denver, just in a different form." "That was different. That was just survival." "This is survival too, just bigger." They started the way they'd started before, small and careful. Hired workers at fair wages. Bought cattle and chickens and seeds for planting. But this time, Clara built with intention rather than desperation. She created systems that could survive without her, documented processes, trained people to handle problems without constant supervision. She also reached out to the community, not to beg for support, but to offer partnership. She met with Ruth and Sam and Martha, proposed profit-sharing arrangements that benefited everyone. She contacted the railroad camps and mining operations, offered contracts that were sustainable rather than desperate. And slowly, grudgingly, the territory responded. People who'd watched them fail before now watched them try again. And there was something in that second attempt that resonated. Clara had learned from defeat, had come back stronger, smarter, more prepared. That kind of resilience meant something in a place where survival was never guaranteed. 6 months after their return, the ranch was profitable. A year later, it was thriving. 2 years later, Clara and Eleanor had partnered to open a supply business that served the entire territory, providing alternatives to the monopolies that had once controlled everything. It wasn't revenge. Helena Graves was dead, her empire dismantled, her influence scattered. But it was something better than revenge. It was proof that systems could change, that power could be redistributed, that one person's defeat didn't have to mean everyone else's victory. Clara stood on the porch one evening in the spring of 1884, watching sunset paint the land in colors that hurt to look at. 5 years since she'd first arrived at this ranch, desperate and invisible and convinced she had nothing left to lose. She'd been right about that, at least. She'd had nothing to lose, which had made her dangerous in ways powerful people never anticipated. But she'd been wrong about other things, about defeat being permanent, about survival being shameful, about the difference between winning and succeeding. Winning meant beating someone else. Succeeding meant building something that outlasted the fight. Iris joined her on the porch, moving slower these days, but still sharp, still present. Thinking about how far we've come? Thinking about how far there is to go. Always with you. But Iris smiled when she said it. Can't you just enjoy what you've built? I am enjoying it, just also planning the next thing. What next thing? Clara gestured toward the horizon, toward territories beyond this one. There are other places like this, other communities controlled by monopolies and powerful people who think they can't be challenged, other people who need to know that fighting back is possible. You want to do this again, somewhere else? Not alone. But yes, build a model that works, then help other people replicate it. Create systems that can't be easily destroyed because they're distributed, because they serve actual needs, because they're built on relationships rather than intimidation. Iris shook her head, but she was still smiling. You really can't help yourself, can you? Always looking for the next fight. Not a fight, an opportunity. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night. Caleb appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth that used to be a shirt. He'd filled out in the past few years, looked healthier than he had when Clara first met him. Success looked good on him, or maybe it was just the absence of slow defeat. Dinner ready? He asked. Soon. We're just planning the next impossible thing. Of course you are. He joined them on the porch, looking out at land that was his again, that he'd earned twice over. What is it this time? Clara told him about her idea, building a network of cooperatives across multiple territories, creating alternatives to monopolistic control, helping people organize and fight back against systems designed to crush them. That's ambitious, Caleb said when she finished. That's the point. Could fail spectacularly. Probably will, at some point, but we'll learn from it and try again. We, Caleb smiled. You're assuming I'm coming with you, aren't you? He considered this, looking between Clara and Iris and the land that represented everything they'd fought for. Then he nodded. Yeah, I am. Because if I've learned anything from the past 5 years, it's that watching you try impossible things is more interesting than playing it safe. They ate dinner together as the sun finished setting, three people who'd survived what should have destroyed them and decided to keep building anyway. The food was simple but good: vegetables from their garden, bread from their oven, meat from cattle they'd raised themselves. Everything on the table represented work and risk and the refusal to accept that some people deserved power while others deserved nothing. After dinner, Clara walked the property alone, checking fences and livestock the way she'd learned to do. The night was clear and cold, stars sharp enough to cut. Somewhere in the darkness, predators hunted and prey hid, and the land continued its indifferent cycle of life and death. But here, on this small piece of earth, Clara had built something that mattered. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived, desperate and overlooked and convinced her life was over. That woman had been right about some things and wrong about others. Right that the world was cruel and unfair and designed to crush people who didn't fit. Wrong that there was nothing she could do about it, because Clara had done something, had fought and lost and fought again. Had survived when survival seemed impossible, had built when building seemed foolish, had refused over and over again to disappear quietly. And in refusing to disappear, she'd discovered something important: that the opposite of being erased wasn't being remembered. It was being present, taking up space, making noise, building things that other people could use and learn from and replicate. It was leaving the world slightly different than she'd found it, in ways both small and significant. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, lonely and defiant. Clara listened until the sound faded, then turned back toward the house where lights glowed warm against the darkness. She'd started this journey trying to survive. She'd end it trying to help other people do the same. Not out of charity or obligation, but because she'd learned that her own liberation was tied to everyone else's. That monopolies and powerful people thrived when everyone else stayed isolated and afraid. That the only real defense against being crushed was building communities strong enough to support each other. It was a lesson she'd learned the hard way, through failure and defeat and desperate gambles that barely paid off. But it was real in ways comfortable knowledge never was. Clara returned to the porch one last time, looking at land that had almost killed her and now represented everything she'd built. Caleb and Iris were inside, probably arguing about something inconsequential the way people did when they'd survived enough together to take small conflicts lightly. Tomorrow, they'd start planning the next venture, the next impossible thing, the next attempt to prove that people didn't have to accept the world as it was, that they could build something better if they were willing to fight for it. But tonight, Clara just stood in the darkness and felt the weight of everything she'd accomplished. It wasn't the victory she'd imagined when she first arrived. There had been no dramatic triumph, no moment of vindication, no defeat of enemies that felt like justice. Instead, there was this: a ranch that worked, a business that thrived, a community that had options it hadn't had before. People who'd been told they couldn't succeed, proving that assessment wrong. It was smaller than epic victory, but it was also more substantial, more lasting, more real. And for someone who'd spent her entire life being told she was too much and never enough, who'd fought to exist in spaces that didn't want her, who'd survived by refusing to make herself smaller, for that person, this quiet success felt like revolution. Clara smiled into the darkness, at the land and the stars and the impossible future she was going to build anyway. Then she went inside to her life, to her people, to the work that would never be finished but was worth doing anyway. Because that's what survival looked like in the end. Not dramatic victories or perfect outcomes. Just the stubborn decision to keep building, keep fighting, keep taking up space in a world that would rather you disappear. And Clara Whitmore had decided long ago and every day since that she would do anything except disappear. She would build instead, would fight instead, would exist loudly and unapologetically until the day she died. And if that made her difficult or troublesome or too much for comfortable people to handle, well, that was their problem, not hers. She'd earned her space. She'd proven her worth, and she wasn't going anywhere except forward, into whatever impossible thing came next. The ranch settled into night around her. Animals sleeping, fires banked, people resting from honest work. Everything quiet except for the wind and the distant coyotes and Clara's own thoughts. It was enough. It had to be. And for the first time in her life, Clara believed that it actually was.